Evening. Welcome, welcome. I think I'm saying your name correctly. Is it Nehemia?
Hello, good afternoon, ma'am.
Afternoon. Am I saying your name correctly?
Oh, kinda. It's Nehemiah.
Oh, Nehemiah sounds better than I'm saying it, so I like that better. Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to join. I am a little bit earlier. While we waiting for everyone, I thought I'd just get to know everyone, get to know everybody's names to make it a little bit more personal. Also, just to find out what your struggles are when it comes to Matric English or home language. So, any struggles that you feel, or any areas that you feel that you need more work on?
Oh, it's normally paper two, which I have a problem, and also a little bit of paper one.
Okay, I think most people, I think with paper one, it would be more or less the language or even the comprehension section. With paper two, just because the literature does seem a little bit overwhelming, it can be a trick or a little bit tricky to get used to. So what I'll do today is I'll start with poetry, just a little bit of the guides of the prescribed poems, and then some strategies for tackling prescribed and basically unseen poems as well. But from there on, I'll also move to literature as we go along. So just to confirm, what are your set work books or what books are you writing on for the exam?
The books I'm writing on is Life of Pi and Hamlet, and there's a
Okay,
book called like Imaginary Worlds, but I think it's just poetry.
okay, perfect. So the imaginary worlds, all the poems, all the people have the same poems countrywide. It's just the set works that will differ a little bit. Life of Pi is a good one. I also have quite a bit of notes. So what I'll request from Apex Academic Center of Excellence is just that we can share it with everyone. So everyone can have that also.
Okay, ma'am, thank you.
Okay, I see Zamu's joining us. So, generally, do you know how many people join in on the matric classes? Just so I have a more or less estimate.
This is my first time coming
Okay,
to
okay.
class.
Mine's as well. So we'll both learn together. Okay, so I'm just giving it a few seconds. I'll start it exactly 4 just to give us time. Hi, Zamu. Am I saying your name correctly? Just checking in. If you are shy to talk, you can always chat to me on the chat box just so that I know you're hearing me, I'm hearing you. I'm based in Johannesburg, so it's a little bit rainy with thunderous skies today, so it's going to be a little bit loud. Thankfully, most of the thunder or the roars of thunder happened between 3 and 4. So I'm hoping that it's a little bit more settled now. But if you do hear that, I did get a pair of noise cancellation headsets. That's why I stopped my video. I was like, I'm going to get these big headsets. But yeah, if at any time you need to see me, just let me know in the chat and we can always do that. I think sometimes everybody, especially matrics, they feel from prior experience, they feel a little bit uncomfortable on the camera. So yeah, that's basically it. So for these sessions, nothing too stressful. I do have quite intensive notes that you guys can use in preparation. I will share that with you as best as I can. Another thing that I will do for you guys is start to give you written out essays for your various set work books, just so that you can use that as a guide to prepare, to get acquainted with, to learn off by heart if you have to. A few suggestions that I'll make is I'm going to start with poetry today. I did mention that I'll do poetry first, and then we can get into our literature as well, because I know most of our problems arise in paper two, but I'll also cover paper one. As we go through poems, I will send you the notes and the slides to make it easier for you and so that you have something to work with as well. Not just having the poems itself, but also having more in-depth notes to go over, places where you can learn things like the tone, the structure of the poem off by heart. And that's where I come to a lot of off by heart or by hearting for English. So a lot of people say that English is a subject that you have to understand. I'm not going to contest this fact. It is true. But with English, there's a lot of things you can learn by heart, which will make your struggles a little bit easier. So scene poetry is one of the things that you can learn off by heart. You can learn the answers to questions from the memo off by heart. You can learn things like the tone of a poem, the structure of the poem off by heart, so that when you get to the poem, you don't even have to think of it. You've already learned it off by heart. So those are my key tips that I'll give you. And I did mention providing for you guys some essays with regards to your set works, just so that you have a better idea. Yeah, so I've noted some set works are Life of Pi and Hamlet. I just want to, because I know we an eclectic mix from all different provinces. I just want to know, you can type to me in the chat or open your mics. What is everybody's set works? So I have Life of Pi and Hamlet already. Do you have any other set works that's a little bit different? So that would be your literature books, the ones that you're going to write your exams on. Any different books besides Life of Pi and Hamlet? Perhaps Othello, the Picture of Dorian Gray. The Crucible. Okay, perfect. Okay, so quite a lot of different set works. So we'll see how best we can plan for that. We'll try to be broad, but also in depth. I do have notes for almost all the set works, so I will also share that with you. And mostly essay topics for most of the books. So hopefully that will guide you a little bit more. But yeah, I'm gonna pronounce your name wrong, but you're gonna correct me. Is it Liego?
No, it's Liajo.
Liajo. Okay, perfect. So the other name I said in a very Indian way, and then I got corrected, which is it sounded much better when it was corrected. So I like that you corrected me. Okay, Liajo, what is your set work books? Do you have the same set work books in Life of Pi and Hamlet, or is it something else? The books
No,
that
it's Life of Pi and Hamlet.
Okay, perfect. So 2 Life of Pies and Hamlet, and then 1 The Crucible. Samu, what The Crucible, is there any other book that you're doing besides The Crucible? Is it also Life of Pi? I know a lot of people do. Okay, perfect. So Life of Pi is our common. So next week we can start tackling Life of Pi. It is quite an intensive one. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much. As people join, they can join us. I'm going to start. What I'll start with is our scene poems. So the good news is every province for grade 12 have the same scene poems. So that makes it a little bit easier. But when I do this lesson, I'm going to give you overall poetry tips that would be dealing with seen and unseen poem. So as we prep for paper 2, we also realize that although we get to choose 3 seen poems from the 12 that we have to learn this year, there's also an unseen poem that we have to attempt. So the rule is basically the same. So when we tackle any poem, the first thing to do is to look at the title. So before you even go ahead and read the poem, look at the title. Now, when you look at the title, ask yourself important questions. Because it's poetry, one of the first questions you're going to ask yourself is, are there any figures of speech present in the title? Now, when I say figures of speech, I'm talking of our similes. So comparisons using like or as, when we compare one thing to another using like or as. Metaphors, so direct comparisons without like or as. Are there any personifications, where we're giving something inanimate or non-living a human quality. Are there any alliteration or assonance? So alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound. So for example, slimy, slithering snake, we repeating the S sound in slimy, in slithering, and in snake. And then assonance is a vowel sound. So something like bounce and ounce that has that OU strong sound. So is there any assonance that we need to think about? Is there any apostrophe? So apostrophe as a figure of speech, not as a punctuation mark, is when the poet talks to something that's non-living, inanimate, or something dead. So a lot of you mentioned Hamlet. In Hamlet, Hamlet does talk to the dead king often. So that would be an example of an apostrophe because he's talking to someone who's dead. So someone who's not alive, who's not currently living, etc. So apostrophe is a punctuation mark that's used to show contraction and possession, but it's also a figure of speech. So when you talk to something non-living. So is there any apostrophe? We could talk about all the figures of speech. Is it an idiom? Is it a proverb? So idiom is a figurative saying that doesn't mean exactly what it says. So for example, I'm going to use the current situation. It's raining cats and dogs. Of course, I don't mean that cats and dogs are falling from the sky. I do mean that it's raining hard. So idiom and then proverb. I see a hand up. Yes, you can go.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
what's the difference between an idiom and a metaphor?
Okay, so a metaphor is when we use figurative language. So idioms and metaphors both use figurative language, but a metaphor is when we compare one thing to another thing directly. So I'll give you an example. If I say Joshua is a pole. Now remember, literally Joshua can't be a pole because he's a boy. But when I say Joshua is a pole, I'm comparing him to a pole because perhaps he's very thin and a pole is also thin. So Joshua is a pole is a metaphor. But when I use idioms, idioms are figurative sayings. So idioms also link with cliches. Have you heard of cliches before?
Yeah.
Cliches, yeah. So cliches are those sayings that we use so often they lose their aspect or their element, and they no more so incredible in writing because we use them so often. So something like as easy as pie is an idiom. Now remember, as easy as pie is also a comparison because we're comparing something, maybe a test paper to being easy like pie. But at the same time, it's an idiom because it's a saying we use so often. So for idioms, a lot of idioms could also appear to be metaphors and they could also be similes. But they are those sayings that we hear often that don't literally mean what they say. So for example, the example I use is it's raining cats and dogs. Now, we know that it's not raining literal cats and dogs, but what the saying means is it's raining hard. So that one we use often, it's an idiom. Something else like I said, as easy as pie, even though it's a simile, it's also an idiom because we use it very often. So the thing with idioms, it becomes very easy if you go through an idiom list because they are commonly used sayings that we use all the time. So even a piece of cake, that's an idiom. But when we say the test is a piece of cake, again, it's a metaphor and an idiom. So most idioms will be idioms and similes or idioms and metaphors. But idioms, we know them because we learn them off by heart. We say them very often. So what I can do for you is give you a list of the commonly used idioms. And you can just go through them, see what they mean. So even if it comes out in a comprehension paper, you have more or less an idea of what the idiom is saying. I notice a lot of times they like to use idioms in comprehension papers as well. So it's good to learn some of the commonly used idioms. But that's an excellent question because most idioms are metaphors and similes as well. Okay, so talking about that, we know more or less some of the figures of speech. When we look at this title, so our poem is by Sipho Sipamala and it's called Talk to the Peach Tree. Now, when we look at the title Talk to the Peach Tree, is there any figures of speech that stand out? So any figures of speech that maybe pops out at you?
It's not a problem. It shows at the beginning additional chats. So this is how we're going to read aberrations. I'm going to say aberration first.
Okay, I think. Okay. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I don't know. I think someone else joined in during our session. I'm just checking that out at the same time. Okay, just to keep in mind, yeah, so we said that figures of speech in the title. So one of the things I told you about was apostrophe as a figure of speech, whereby we're talking to something non-living. Now, even though when we do bio, we classify a tree as living, in this case, we know the tree can't really talk back to you. So if you had to go talk to a tree, it can't speak to you. So that's why we say talk to the peach tree. It's a form of apostrophe, because in this case, what the poet is doing is talking to something inanimate or non-living. Now, aside from just looking at figures of speech in the title, we also have to look at parts of speech. Now, our parts of speech, if we recap, is everything from our nouns to our verbs, to our adverbs, to our adjectives, and so forth. Even things like articles fall in our parts of speech. So remember, articles, we get something like newspaper articles in English, but as a part of speech, it's words like the, or an. So when I look at talk to the peach tree, I'm not talking about any peach tree. The word the or the article the tells us it's a specific peach tree that Sipho Sipamala is talking about. Now, this is where it's important to look at the title. When we look at the title, we said, okay, the poet is talking to something that's non-living, and the poet is talking to a specific peach tree. So perhaps the peach tree has some sort of symbolism for our poet. I'll get into that in a second. So what we did there was actively analyze the title. Once we know the title, it makes it a little bit easier to go through the poem as a whole and to understand what exactly the poem is about. Sometimes the title gives away the entire story of the poem. So there's another Matric poem called Shipwreck, and basically the title gives away the entire poem about what the poem is about. So it's about a shipwreck. It's obviously going to be sad because anytime a shipwreck happens, people lose their lives, etc. Now, in Talk to the Peach Tree, we do understand that the poet is providing an absurd statement of talking to a peach tree that's non-living, but it doesn't give away too much of our poem. That's when we look at our poet's name. So sometimes in some poets, we do know them because we studied them from grade 10 or 9 onwards. Sometimes when it comes to the poets, what actually happens is when we look at the poets, we realize that the poets are people we know, or the names resonate with us. Like Sipho Sipamala, we know from the name Sipho that it's an African poet. That's one of the things. So automatically, when we think of African poets, particularly from South Africa, our mind naturally goes to the time of apartheid. And when we naturally go to the time of apartheid, it makes it a lot easier for us to see poems in that context. And I'm talking about apartheid because this particular poem does deal with the apartheid era. So that's what we have there. Okay, so we have Talk to the Peach Tree by Sipho Sipamala. And we talked about the poem being an African poet. So more or less from his name, we assume that maybe he's bringing in some aspect of apartheid. There'll be other poets that you stumble across in your home language, like Ingrid Jonker. Now, Ingrid Jonker, already the surname Jonker is an Afrikaner surname, so it tells us an Afrikaner poet. And when we think of Afrikaner poets from South Africa, from Transvaal, where Ingrid Jonker was from, we also think of the apartheid era. Remember, a lot of the past poets were affected by apartheid. So a lot of the poetry we deal with from South African poet perspective is on the apartheid era. So this is where the poem starts. Let's talk to the peach tree. Let's talk to the swallows visiting us in the summer. Ask how it is in other countries. So now the poet is extending this absurdity or this absurd idea that we need to talk to a lot of things. So not only are we talking to the peach tree, but we're also talking to swallows. Now, we can't say it's a personification by saying talk to swallows, because we know swallows are living, they're birds, but nevertheless, they can't really talk back to us. So they can't tell us how they're feeling, etc. So it does seem absurd. Let's talk to the swallows visiting us in summer. Now, what we know about swallows and all birds, in fact, is that they are migratory birds. So they move away to other countries, to warmer countries for their summer. And then they come back to our country when it is our summer. So when it's our winter, they rather go to other countries to be warmer. They'll come back when it's summer. So when they come back, we're going to ask them how it is in other countries. Now, one of the reasons Sipho Sipamala is prompting that we ask them how it is in other countries is because perhaps the state in our country is not that great. Perhaps other countries are not experiencing what we are experiencing in our home country, which is South Africa. Let's talk to the afternoon shadow. Ask how the day has been so far. Now again, just like the absurdity in talking to the swallows and the peach tree, again the poet is saying we need to talk to the afternoon shadow. The afternoon shadow is the shadow left when the sun is going a little bit more down, and we then asking the shadow how the day has been so far. So what the day has been like in our specific country. Then let's raise our pets to our level. Ask them what they don't know of us. Now, when we're raising our pets to our level, again, it's the absurdity of talking to even our pets that can't give us an answer. But with this statement, it's the idea that during the apartheid era, African people were treated very unfairly. So they were almost treated worse than pets. So now we're asking our pets what they know about us. Now, what you would also have noticed is in the first stanza, the second stanza, and the third stanza, the word let's has been repeated. The word talk has been repeated twice. In the third stanza, however, it's let's raise our pets. So a little bit of a different idea than talk. But nevertheless, the repetition of the let's in poetry is called anaphora. Anaphora is when we repeat an idea or a term. So I'm just going to write it here so we can see the spelling. Anaphora. There we go. So that's a repetition of a term or an idea. So a lot of the poems that we do in Matric, you'll see Ingrid Jonker's A Child Who Was Shot Dead by Soldiers at Inyanga, also uses a lot of anaphora or repetition. So we go on a little bit further, and the poet says to us, words have lost meaning. Like all notations, they've been misused. So this is where we get the idea that there has been conversation and people did try to speak about their situation in South Africa, but perhaps because they are enduring suffering, because they're going through pain, the meaning of what they wanted to say got lost. So the meaning of what they wanted to say wasn't so clear-cut. And all notations, like all notations, they've been misused. So words have been misused. Perhaps dialogue or conversation has been misunderstood. So speaking to the people who we need to speak to hasn't worked so far. So that's one of the things that the poet is pointing out. Then the poet goes on to say, most people will admit a whining woman can overstate her case. So whining is somebody who's complaining, who's going on and on about their situation. So because this person is going through trouble or troubled times, maybe this person is whining and going on and on of their situation. So that's why we say the whining woman can overstate her case. But here, what we need to look at is the figure of speech as well. So in whining, there's a W. In woman, there's a W. when there's a repetition of a sound, a consonant sound, we call it an alliteration. So a whining woman can overstate her case. Whining woman is an example of an alliteration. So we know that the people who experienced apartheid, the people who experienced the struggle, did try to speak, but their words lost meaning perhaps. And even we realize that because they're complaining about the state of affairs, it seems like they're being over dramatic. This is for the first time where the poet tells us to talk to the paralyzing heat in the air. Now, when we go through poems, whether it be seen like this one or unseen, one of the things we must remember is connotation and denotation. So, connotation, and then we have denotation. Now, when we look at the meaning of connotation, connotation is always the feelings and emotions we link to words. So feelings linked to words. When we talk about denotation, the word D is also the starting letter of the word dictionary. So this is the actual dictionary meaning of something. So we know that if we look up the word paralyzing in a dictionary, we'll get a certain meaning. In fact, let me give you the exact meaning. So if I look up the word paralyzing in the dictionary, it gives me the meaning causing a part or a person to become partly or wholly incapable of movement. So paralyzing is when you're unable to move. When you're paralyzed, you're unable to move. But the feeling that I associate with the word paralyzing is something excruciating, something sad, something difficult to bear. Those are the connotations I associate with paralyzing. So when the poet says, talk to the paralyzing heat, this is the first time that the poet gives us insight that, look, the people in South Africa, the African people are undergoing oppression. This paralyzing heat means the oppression that the people are undergoing. So talk to the paralyzing heat in the air. Again, it's absurd because we can't really speak to the paralyzing heat. Inquire how long the mercilessness will last. So we need to find out how long this mercilessness, this brutality, this oppression will last. Let's pick out items from the rubbish heap. Ask how the stench is down there. So now the poet is going even further to talk to items in the rubbish heap, meaning the dustbin. Remember, in the apartheid era, African people were treated almost like they were rubbish, almost like they were items in the rubbish heap. So that's also the connotation that the poet is bringing up here, the feelings of being oppressed to the extent where you're treated like rubbish. So in this case, he's saying we need to talk to the rubbish heap, ask how the stench is like down there, how the smell is like down there. Let's talk to the peach tree. Now, this is where the peach tree, like in the title, is mentioned again. The thing about the peach tree is Sipho Sipamala had a particular attachment to the peach tree outside his house. So a lot of the poems that he wrote, maybe not even just talk to the peach tree, but a lot of other ones that didn't have the term peach tree in the title also talked about a particular peach tree. So they say that Sipho Sipamala was the poet known for writing about the peach tree. Just a little bit extra information. So much so that even in his will, he wrote the peach tree outside his house as sort of inheritance for his children. So a little bit of extra facts there, but the peach tree obviously had symbolism to him. Now, what the peach tree means in context of the poem is, remember, during the apartheid times, we learned things about the Group Areas Act, where people were forcefully removed from their areas of land and they were forced to live in designated areas of land. So in the same way, the peach tree is a tree that's firmly rooted in the ground. It cannot be forcefully moved anywhere else. It stands its ground, it holds its ground, and it can't move. So that's why Sipho Sipamala suggests that the people who are being oppressed, the Africans, speak directly to the peach tree because it is firmly rooted in the ground. So they need to find out How does it feel to be rooted, to not be removed, to not be moved to designated areas? Then he says, let's talk to the moon going down. Ask if it isn't enough eyeing what's been going on. So here again, we're speaking to something like the moon. After daybreak, we're asking the moon if it's noticing what's going on in our land. Now, enough in eyeing, we could also say the E sound is quite prominent, but E is a vowel. So unlike the whining woman, where we had the alliteration sound, the repetition of the consonant, for the enough eyeing, it's more of an assonant sound because it's a vowel sound that's repeated. What's important to remember with alliteration? Alliteration is easier to find because most of the time it's at the beginning of the word. Assonance doesn't have to be at the beginning of the word. So the example that I gave you was bounce and ounce, where it's the OU sound. So bounce and ounce is in the middle of the word. So that makes assonance and alliteration a little bit different. The other difference is assonance deals with vowels, whereas alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds. Okay, so then he goes, come on. Now, this is where he speaks to everyone. He says, come on, let's all do it together. Let's talk to the devil himself. It's about time. Now, just by looking at the word devil, for the first time, Sipho Sipamala is talking about someone who can actually respond. Who do you think the devil will be? When he says, let's talk to the devil himself, who do you think he's talking about here? Who could the devil be? Any guesses? Yeah, go ahead. Give it a try.
The apartheid government.
Yes. Okay, so exactly that. So the oppressors. We can call it the apartheid government because we know that the apartheid government did set into place the laws of oppression, or we can call them the oppressors. So the oppressors at the time, the apartheid government, that's who Sipamala feels we need to speak to. Because when he says it's about time, you can see that talking has been done. There has been political discussion, but thus far, the discussion hasn't got the people anywhere. It hasn't earned the people freedom. So it's time for peaceful protest, for peaceful talking, and for talking to happen so that the situation can change. Okay, in terms of my slides, I'll just go through them very briefly and then go into a little bit of deeper notes for this particular poem. It is one of the easiest grade 12 poems. That's why I like to start with it, because once you sort of on a roll with this one, the rest becomes even easier. Okay, in terms of Sipho Sipamala, we know from his name, he's a South African poet. He was born in Johannesburg and he died in 2007. He is South Africa's most prolific protest poet. So what's important knowing Sipho Sipamala, like I told you, especially when you get an unseen poem, if you know the poet, it helps you to understand perhaps what the poem could be about. So because we know that Sipho Sipamala is a protest poet, we know that most of the subjects of his poem is about apartheid. So if you get an unseen poem by him, you know probably he's talking about the oppressors, he's talking about the oppression, he's talking about the struggles during apartheid. So he was opposed to the apartheid regime, and with the fall of apartheid, he served on the government's art and culture task group. So just a little bit insight of him in case you see other poems by him, but it's good to know which poets form part of the protest poets who mainly wrote poems about apartheid. So this poem, Talk to the Peach Tree, was obviously written during the apartheid era or years. It was where Sipho Sipamala used his voice and portrayed his opinion on the political talks that took place between various parties before the formalized end of apartheid. Now, when he wrote this poem, apartheid was still ongoing. Despite political conversations that happened between the different parties, nothing had changed. That's why Sipho Sipamala in his poem says, it's time for change. It's time for us to speak. Okay, then the speaker's peacemaking or peaceful attitude is clear. Remember, he's not being forceful where he's saying, let's go and fight, let's bomb, no. He just wants to talk, and talk is a peaceful form of protest. So that's why we can say the speaker is peaceful throughout the poem. In terms of the structure, when we talk of a free verse poem, it means that it's a poem that doesn't have a specific rhyme scheme. So there's no certain rhyme schemes. We don't have words at the end of each line that rhyme with each other. It's a free verse poem. In terms of stanza 3, 7, 8, and 9, they have the same pattern, meaning the way that the sentences or the lines are written are similar. They have the similar word choice with a lot of anaphora that we saw, repetition. They have the same length and content. So they all deal with the subject of talking to absurd objects or elements of nature. Then the indents in the 4th and 5th stanzas alert the reader to the fact that these stanzas are commentary on the situation. So I'm going to quickly go up to the 4th and 5th stanza. It's here where the poet talks about words have lost their meaning, and most people will admit. Now, why I like this particular slide is they make the indent clear. What an indent is if you were on your computer on a Word document, if you just press the tab key, those particular letters or words would go a little bit further inside the page than the other words that you wrote without pressing the tab key. So that's an indent. And the reason why indentation is used in the poem is because this is Sipho Sipamala's way of giving us commentary. So he's saying that there has been political discussions that occurred between the apartheid government, the oppressors, and other political party, but words lost their meaning. So because of propaganda and promoting the situation of apartheid, whenever the oppressed people or parties tried to state their case, their words lost their meaning, and it seemed like they were whining or complaining too much, when this wasn't actually the case. So here he does give us a little bit of commentary on the situation. In terms of the diction, now remember, diction is also a word that comes from the word dictionary, and dictionary, we know we find words. So diction means word choice. What words the poet chose to use when writing his poem? It's colloquial diction. Now, colloquial is a fancy way of saying layman language or everyday language. How we speak to each other, how I'm speaking to you now, that's colloquial or conversational English. So it's a way of saying it's a conversational tone. It gives that conversational tone to the poem, and it's not a sophisticated or formal diction. It's very informal. Then the poet addresses the reader directly by constantly using the apostrophe word let's. Let's stands for let us. So the poet is including us in the discussion. The poet is saying, let us talk to the oppressors. Let us have peaceful protests. Okay, then the peach tree. I told you a little bit of the symbolism. The peach tree appears in many of Sipho Sipamala's poems. It is an element of nature. So again, let's talk to nature. But one more symbolism that I mentioned to you that isn't contained so deeply in this notes is the fact that Sipho Sipamala talks about the peach tree because it's rooted firmly in the ground. And because it's rooted firmly in the ground, it can't be forcefully removed like people or other things. So that's what we have in terms of the peach tree. Okay, I'm not going to go through the poem again. I'm going to go through the analysis now. So let me clear all my drawings and go down. So we've read through the poem. In terms of talk to the swallows, there is a personification here. So the personification is we giving the swallows human qualities of moving and talking. We know that swallows migrate or move in the for the summer to experience the summer. And we assuming or we giving them the quality of being able to talk to us about the experience in other countries that are obviously free from apartheid. Then lines 1 to 6, the tone is light-hearted, it's teasing and humorous. I used a word absurd, which means almost ridiculous, quite a lot. So it is teasing, it's humorous, it has wit, but there is an underlying message. Yes, I see a question. Come on, you can ask.
Can you please slow down? You're too
Okay,
fast.
I'll go a little slower. Let me know if it's okay for you. Okay, so in terms of the tone, it is light-hearted and witty. Witty means funny, but it does have an underlying message. So the underlying message is that of political opinion. The fact that despite discussions ongoing in South Africa, apartheid hasn't ended. Okay, then when the poet says, ask them what they don't know of us. Now, during the apartheid opportunity, the different races didn't mix. So they had very little chances to find out about each other or to find out what was actually going on with each other. So that's why the poet is saying they had little, the white people, the oppressors, they have little knowledge of the other races. So that's why when we speak to our pets, let's find out what they actually know about us African people. So that's what the poet is saying. In terms of the second stanza, this we call the commentary. Remember, this is indented, meaning it's a little bit more inside the line to show that the poet is giving us a bit of commentary. So the poet says words have lost their meaning. So what the poet is talking about is the fact that talking has become useless. There's no point in just talking because thus far it hasn't got us anywhere. It has not ended our oppression or our situation. When the poet uses the word like all notations or the word notation, it's a system of writing. So talking has become useless and even writing has become useless because language has become twisted and used in such a way that it conveys lies. Now, whenever the government wants people to buy into something, when they want you to believe, yes, the African people must be oppressed, they use what we call propaganda. Propaganda is when you twist words so that you can sell what you want to do. So propaganda during the apartheid time couldn't be trusted. So words couldn't be trusted anymore because when people spoke, it was useless. And when things were written down or when people tried to express in writing the struggles, their words were twisted and propaganda was sold to people. So the original intentions behind their message got lost. Then we talk about the whining woman overstating her case. Whining, I told you, has a negative connotation. So just to recap, connotation is often the feeling that we associate to something. So a feeling that we link to something. So when we talk about whining, it's like, oh, and I'm so tired, and that's whining. So it's a negative connotation. So because of her high-pitched voice and the fact that she was complaining all the time, it felt like she was overstating her case. So people are sometimes over-emotional and they're over-exaggerating their situation. However, according to Sipho Sipamala, the dialogue needed to happen because the people were oppressed. They weren't just complaining for nothing, or they weren't over-exaggerating how bad their situation was. Okay, then we talked about the indented lines. Again, I'll remind you, indented lines are lines that are a little bit more inside in comparison to the other lines. And they are used to show that this is the commentary. So the entire stanza, words have lost their meaning, like all notation, they've been misused. Most people will admit a whining woman can overstate her case. These are all intentions or commentaries from the poet. Then the poet talks about talking to the paralyzing heat. So here we talked about paralyzing, which, like the word whining, also has a negative connotation. Paralyzing means the heat, the oppression. So people are unable to do anything else because the oppression is almost intolerable. It's almost unbearable. In terms of heat, the figurative meaning is the oppression. The other heat is how hot it is. So the literal meaning is how hot it is, but the people are only feeling overheated or boiling because of their oppression and because of their situation. Inquire how long the mercilessness will last. Now, mercilessness is a time where there's no empathy or no mercy or no compassion for the oppressed people. So we want to know how long this mercilessness will last. When will this oppression stop? In terms of the tone here, the tone is serious because it's describing the reality of the situation of the Black people in South Africa during apartheid. So basically here the tone changes from the initial absurd tone or a witty tone or a humorous tone to a more serious tone because we realize the mercilessness, the oppression is so strong and people are finding their situation almost unbearable. Then the poet says, let's pick out items from the rubbish heap. When he talks about items, he uses this to refer to the non-white people, so the Black people in South Africa. And why he uses this degrading image by calling the Black people items is because during the apartheid times, African people, Black people, non-whites, they were all seen almost in a negative way. They were not seen as being human beings. So that's why he uses this degrading image, because it also helps us understand how the oppression was during that time or how people felt. They were belittled, they were degraded, they were not seen as human. So we obviously understand their pain and suffering. Then when he talks about the rubbish heap, again, he's talking about the Black people who were discarded almost like they were rubbish. So they were thrown away like they were belittled and thrown away like they meant nothing. So they were regarded as less. Then when he says, ask how the stench is down there. Now, smell is a very different word to stench. If I say I smell something nice, smell can have a positive connotation. I can also say I smell something funny or fishy or bad, and then it has a negative connotation. But stench is something that stinks so bad I can't stand it. So the word stench also has a negative connotation. Basically, we need to ask what life is like for non-whites because they disregarded, they degraded, and they treated almost as if they smelly, almost as if they stink and they're not worth it. So that's what the poet is talking about. Remember, now the poet is actually explaining what the situation is like for the non-whites in South Africa during this apartheid time. Then the poet talks to our famous peach tree. He says, let's talk to the peach tree and find out how it feels to be in the ground. Here, the peach tree has a positive connotation. Again, it is rooted in the ground, meaning it is permanently there, it has a home. We asking this peach tree how it feels to be in the ground. We asking the tree, how does it feel to have a permanent home where you can live and thrive and be fruitful? Remember, a peach tree is a tree that bears fruit, it bears peaches. So obviously it's fruitful, but another meaning of fruitful is to be productive and successful. Remember, the non-whites during the apartheid era was given little opportunity, or they were given little opportunity to actually be productive or successful or earn any form of wealth. So this way, by asking the peach tree how it feels to be productive, we can understand what success feels like, because obviously as non-whites in South Africa, at this time, we don't feel successful. Then let's talk to the moon going down. Ask if it isn't eyeing what's been going on. So the moon, we know at night, it looks down on the country. So by speaking to the moon, what the poet is asking is to get another perspective, a nicer way of saying perspective, to get another view on what is going down in the country, what's going on, what's happening in the country. Then we said, let's talk to the devil himself. We call the devil the oppressors, the apartheid system, the apartheid government. So it's about time, meaning it's time for peace. We need to end the fighting. It's time for equal rights. So here the tone changes to a tone of relief, because the speaker is actually looking forward to that conversation that needs to happen between the two political parties, whereby they negotiate and they talk for the peace of the non-white people. In terms of the themes in this poem, it's the need for decent conversation or peaceful conversation to happen between the white people and the black people in order for the situation of the oppressed to change. So the only way that things can change in South Africa is if we have this conversation. Okay, before I go on a little bit more in detail on the same poem, are there any questions about Talk to the Peach Tree? Anything that you don't understand? Anything that you want me to repeat? Okay, it gets a lot easier. What I will do for you is share the slides. I'll also share my in-depth notes. There are quite a few notes, but I won't overwhelm you this week. I'll share with you 2 notes. So the slide that we just went through, and I'll share with you this particular note, just so that you get an idea of the different aspects of the poem. You start to learn it off by heart. So every time you see Sipho Sipamala's poem, Talk to the Peach Tree, it's a lot easier and you know exactly how to tackle it or how to answer it. So I'm not going to repeat about Sipho Sipamala and his history or the context of the poem, because we all know it was written during the apartheid years by Sipho Sipamala, a protest poet. But just to repeat the form of the poem, remember it is a free verse poem. It's written in free verse so that the poet can let his ideas flow. Remember, the poet has ideas on how we can change the situation in South Africa. So he's letting his ideas flow. Therefore, it's in free verse, so there's no recognizable form. Then we know that stanzas 3, 7, and 8 all have the same pattern, the same diction, word choice, the same length, and the same content. Then the indents in the 4th and 5th stanzas are there to provide commentary on the overall situation. So I repeated this twice or thrice just so that it sticks in your head. Remember, I said one of the best tips I can give you for poetry is to always learn certain things off by heart. So things like the form and structure of the poem, Talk to the Peach Tree, you can learn it off by heart. It makes it easier. In terms of the diction or the word choice that the poet uses, he uses a very casual and conversational diction. Remember, the idea of the poet is to talk to us, to talk to the apartheid government. So it is a conversational diction and it is a conversational or colloquial register. Remember, conversational and colloquial is more or less a way of saying the same thing. When we say colloquial language, it's everyday language when we speak to each other. Like when I came in, I didn't say, hello, sir, with regards to, I didn't use any formal terms. We converse with each other how we speak every day. So that we call colloquial or conversational diction. The poem is set out to be a conversation. Then I talked about the absurdities. So given the absurdities or how absurd the speaker's suggestions are, there's a great use of personification throughout the poem. Remember, every time he says, let's talk to an inanimate object, a non-living object, he's giving that object the person quality of being able to converse or talk back. So the poet emphasizes how useless or futile suggestions have become. He highlights the speaker's wish for all situations to be seen from both perspectives. Then the speaker uses anaphora or the repetition of lats, and this becomes a rallying call. Now, rallying call is when you gather up the troops and you go do something. So he's rallying a call to all the Black people to stand together and have these conversations. So he's saying that conversations need to be had, and it's a rhetorical device that he uses that includes the reader and tries to persuade him or her to take action. In terms of the tone, we know that initially the tone is witty, it's humorous, it's casual, but then in lines 11 onwards, the poet becomes more angry, especially when he talks about the paralyzing heat and the situation that the Black people are undergoing in South Africa, where he talks about the rubbish heap and the stench down there. That's when the tone changes to a little bit more angry. The title alludes to the speaker's limited ability to speak freely in apartheid. So we have to talk to the peach tree because in apartheid, the Black people's voices were curbed. They couldn't speak as freely. So the wild peach tree, which grows easily in most parts of South Africa, was commonly found in many township yards. The thing about the peach tree was that it was rooted in the soil, which is exactly the opposite of the situation of the people. They were constantly being uprooted, meaning they didn't own any land and they were constantly being thrown from one area to another. The tone from lines 10 onwards is that of reasonable conversation interlaced with irony. We can see that the poet is also being sarcastic. When we talk about sarcastic, what does sarcasm mean? So like when he says, let's raise the pets to our level, ask what they know about us. That's where the poet is being sarcastic. What do you think sarcasm means? Any guesses? So sarcasm is always irony that is meant to hurt. Now, irony is the opposite or saying the opposite of what you mean. So for example, if I say, for example, okay, say I asked a question and no one answered, like when I asked what sarcasm or sarcastic. And I wanted to be mean, so I wanted to use sarcasm. So I make a comment like this, and I'm going to say it in a tone that will show you a little bit more of sarcasm. I say, everybody really brought their brain to class today. So what I'm saying is no one's using their brain, but I'm saying the opposite of what I actually want to say, like no one's thinking today. So that hurts because when you think of the meaning and when you think of my tone, I'm actually being mean. So that we call sarcasm. Sarcasm is a way of using irony to hurt. So from lines 11 onwards, we said the tone changes to anger, but the last 3 lines is the rallying call, the call to action, the call to have conversations. So the peach tree is a metaphor for how Black Africans were uprooted and forced into locations or townships. It becomes a symbol of westernization or oppression. So the peach tree, we can also see it as a symbolism of oppression. Now, if we look here at the questions, one of the questions talks about the symbolism of the peach tree. Now, you might say, okay, the peach tree is a symbol of westernization or oppression, but you will only get 1 mark. And if you look at the mark allocation, it's for 3 marks. So this is where you have to talk about, because the peach tree, unlike the African people or the Black people, were uprooted. Was rooted in the ground, whereas the Black African people were uprooted and they were forced into townships and locations. When we talk about the peach tree, Sipho Sipamala recognizes that because the peach tree is rooted in the ground, the peach tree has the opportunity to become fruitful, to be productive, whereas the Black people were not given this opportunity. Okay. Then, like a question like, who is the devil in the last stanza? We said the apartheid government, the oppressors, the apartheid system. We can mention all 3, but it's only for 1 mark. So one of the main things to note when tackling poetry questions is the mark allocation next to the questions. And we see this with lots and lots of matrics. So when I'm not doing tuition, I am marking for UCT. So I mark for the online matriculants. And one of the main things that we notice is the mark allocation is 3 marks, but the matriculant is only writing a 1-sentence answer. So obviously, if it's for 3 marks, the marker expects you to write at least 3 to 5 sentences to explain what the symbolism of the peach tree is. So always remember that. Okay, I'm getting my 5-minute countdown.